What do you do when your millionaire husband is screwing your brother's fiancée in your own home? Make a scene. No, that is for amateurs. As a lead chemist, I know the strongest bond is not love, it is military industrial glue. When Richard and his mistress wanted to be inseparable, I made that dream a literal agonizing reality in front of 500 guests. Believe me, their screams as doctors tried to peel them apart were sweeter than any apology. My name is Henner Crestwood, and for the last 7 years I have lived my life with the precision of a chemical equation. As the director of research and development at ORAM, I deal in absolutes. I understand how molecules bond, how catalysts accelerate reactions, and how easily a stable compound can become volatile if you introduce the wrong element. I thought I had applied that same rigorous logic to my marriage. I was 34, successful, and married to Richard, a man whose charm was as polished as the marble floors of our foyer. We lived in a sprawling glass and steel mansion overlooking the gray waters of Seattle, a monument to Richard's success in real estate and my inheritance. From the outside, we were the golden couple of the Pacific Northwest. But anyone who works with glass knows that while it is beautiful, it is also cold, and it shatters with terrifying ease. The variables began to change about 6 months ago. Richard, at 42, had always been a handsome man, but suddenly he became obsessed with his preservation. He started spending 3 hours a day at an exclusive fitness club downtown. His wardrobe shifted from conservative bespoke suits to tighter, more youthful cuts that accentuated a physique he was working suspiciously hard to maintain. He came home smelling not of the office or the rain, but of a sharp, citrusy cologne that I had never bought him. When I asked about his late nights, he always had a ready answer involving zoning permits or difficult investors. He was smooth. He was convincing, but I analyzed data for a living, and the data points were starting to drift outside the margin of error. Then there was the matter of my brother, Mark. Mark is 26, with a heart too big for his chest and a bank account too small for his tastes. I love him, but he has always been a moth looking for a flame. 2 months ago, he brought home that flame, and her name was Chloe. Chloe was 23 years old, a platinum blonde with wide, innocent eyes that seemed to sharpen into calculator screens whenever they swept over our living room furniture. Mark was head over heels in love, babbling about how they were soulmates. When they came over for dinner, I watched her. I watched how she touched the silk drapes. I watched how she asked Richard about the square footage of the guest house. She was not just a guest. She was an appraisal agent in a cocktail dress. The catalyst for the explosion, however, came on a rainy Tuesday evening. It was mundane, almost insulting in its simplicity. Richard had come home late again, claiming he had a board meeting that ran over, yet he was carrying his gym bag. He tossed it carelessly onto the bench at the foot of our bed before hopping into the shower, whistling a tune I did not recognize. I am a creature of habit. I like order. The bag was sitting precariously on the edge, threatening to tip over and spill its contents onto my pristine white rug. I sighed and walked over to move it. As I lifted the leather handles, the weight shifted and the bag fell open. It was standard procedure to empty his laundry. I reached in, pulling out a damp towel and a sweaty t-shirt. I was about to zip it back up when I noticed a small zippered compartment on the interior lining that was slightly open. It was not a pocket for keys or a wallet. It was discreet, tucked away behind the structural lining of the bag. Curiosity is a scientist's greatest asset and worst curse. I slid 2 fingers into the pocket. My fingertips brushed against cool plastic. I pulled it out. It was a tube of personal lubricant. Not just any lubricant, but a boutique imported brand that cost upwards of $80 a bottle. It was a silicone-based formula, the kind designed for prolonged, intense friction. Richard and I had a functional scheduled intimacy, but we had never used this. We had never even discussed it. The tube was half empty. I stood there in the quiet of our master bedroom, the sound of the shower running in the adjacent bathroom like white noise. My heart rate did not spike. My hands did not shake. Instead, a cold, analytical calm washed over me. I held the tube up to the light, treating it like a specimen in my lab. That was when I saw it. Caught in the threading of the screw-top cap was a single long hair. It was not my hair. My hair is a dark natural chestnut, cut in a sharp bob. This hair was long, synthetic, and unmistakably platinum blonde. I carefully unwound the strand from the cap. It coiled around my finger, catching the light. Then I brought the tube closer to my face. The scent hit me, faint but undeniable, clinging to the plastic. It was a cloying, heavy floral smell. Midnight rose. My mind flashed back to 3 weeks ago. Mark and K.H. Lowe had been over for brunch. K.H. Lowe had been practically shoving her wrist under my nose, bragging about the gift Mark had bought her with his first bonus check. "It is called Midnight Rose," she had said, her voice high and jeerish. "Isn't it intoxicating? It costs $300 an ounce." I looked at the hair. I smelt the perfume. The equation balanced perfectly. My husband was not just cheating on me. He was cheating on me with my little brother's fiancée. The shower water turned off. I had seconds to react. Instinct urged me to storm into the bathroom, to scream, to throw the tube at his wet chest and demand the truth. But I am not an amateur. I am a strategist. If I confronted him now, he would lie. He would say he bought it for us as a surprise. He would say the hair was from a stray interaction at the gym. He would gaslight me until I doubted my own senses, and worse, they would both go to ground, hiding their tracks better next time. No, I needed more than suspicion. I needed irrefutable proof. I needed to destroy them, not just catch them. With a steady hand, I placed the tube back into the secret compartment. I arranged the towel and the shirt exactly as they had been. I zipped the bag and set it back on the bench, ensuring it looked untouched. When Richard walked out of the bathroom, a towel wrapped around his waist, water dripping from his chest, he smiled at me. It was a dazzling practice smile. "Hey, honey," he said, leaning in to kiss my cheek. "Did you have a good day at the lab?" I smelled the mint of his toothpaste and the lingering ghost of midnight rose beneath his soap. I smiled back. It was the same smile I wore when a difficult experiment finally yielded results. It was enlightening. I said softly, "I think I am on the verge of a major breakthrough." Later that evening, Mark and Chloe came over for a casual dinner. We sat at the long mahogany table, the four of us. Mark was telling a story about his new job, animated and happy. I sat at the head of the table, sipping my wine, saying nothing. I watched Richard's hand rest on the table. I watched K.H. Lowe's foot slide out of her heel under the table. I saw the way their eyes met when Mark looked down to cut his chicken, a quick hungry dart of a glance that lasted less than a second, but spoke volumes. It was a look of shared secrets and contempt for everyone else in the room. They thought they were clever. They thought I was the boring, oblivious scientist wife, too buried in my beakers to notice the chemistry changing in my own home. They were wrong. They had introduced a foreign agent into my environment, and now I was going to study them. I would observe their behavior, map their patterns, and when the time was right, I would introduce a reaction they would never survive. I took another sip of wine. The liquid was dark and rich, masking the bitter taste of betrayal in my mouth. The game had begun, and they did not even know they were playing. Hypothesis formation is the easy part of science. Data collection is where the real work begins. In my laboratory at Oram, I oversee experiments that require absolute sterility and constant monitoring. If a single variable fluctuates, months of work can be ruined. I realized that to catch Richard and Chloe, I had to treat my own home not as a sanctuary, but as a contaminated testing ground. My husband and my brother's fiancée were no longer family. They were lab rats, and I needed to study their behavior in their natural habitat. The first step was digital surveillance. Richard has always been technically incompetent. He treats his smartphone like a magic wand, assuming it simply works without understanding the mechanics. This made him vulnerable. On a Wednesday morning, while he was in the shower, I took his phone from the nightstand. It took me less than 3 minutes to bypass his 4-digit passcode, his birth year, naturally, and install a piece of monitoring software I had modified from a corporate espionage tool we sometimes use to stress test our own security systems. I disguised the app icon as a mandatory system security update and hid it deep within a folder of utilities he never opened. From that moment on, every text message, every call log, and every keystroke he made was mirrored directly to a secure server I accessed via my tablet. Next came the visual confirmation. I took a half day off work, telling my assistant I had a migraine. The house was empty. I moved through the rooms with a tool belt instead of a briefcase. In the home office, I installed a pinhole camera inside the motion sensor of the alarm system. It gave me a wide-angle view of the desk and the leather sofa, but the most critical location was the guest suite. Mark and Chloe stayed over almost every weekend, claiming it saved them the drive back to their small apartment in the city. I placed a hide micro camera inside the ventilation grate directly above the bed. It was undetectable unless you were standing on a ladder with a flashlight, and I knew neither of them would be looking at the ceiling for structural floors. The data began to stream in immediately, but the first significant pattern emerged 2 days later. Mark had gone to a suit fitting for the wedding, a process that would take at least 2 hours. Chloe had declined to go, telling him she wanted to come over to our house early to discuss floral arrangements with me. The only problem was that I was still at work, a fact she knew perfectly well. I sat in my office at Oram, the glow of my monitors illuminating the darkened room. I opened the secure feed. My heart was beating with a steady, dull rhythm against my ribs. On the screen, I saw the interior of my home office. Richard was sitting at his desk, pretending to look at blueprints. The door opened and Chloe walked in. She was not carrying a binder of floral designs. She was wearing a short tennis skirt and a tight crop top. Despite the fact that she had never held a racket in her life, she walked over to Richard, and he spun his chair around to face her. There was no hesitation, no awkward greeting. She simply straddled his lap. I adjusted the volume on my headphones. The audio feed was crystal clear. "Is the idiot gone?" Richard asked, his hands resting familiarly on her waist. Chloe giggled, a sound that made my stomach churn. "He is at the tailor. I told him to take his time. He is so obsessed with that cheap suit. He thinks he looks like James Bond, but he looks more like a valet driver." Richard laughed, a cruel barking sound. "Let him enjoy it. Once we get his signature on the trust fund release forms after the wedding, he can go back to driving a Honda. And speaking of idiots, where is the ice queen at the lab?" "Obviously," K.H. Lowe said, leaning in to nip at his ear. "Probably mixing potions. God, she is so boring. I do not know how you survive 10 years with her. She is like a dry old maid. It has been a long decade." Richard sighed, and I watched him run his hand through her platinum hair. "But it pays the bills. Or at least it did. We are almost at the finish line, baby." I sat frozen in my ergonomic chair. The insults to my personality were expected. I knew I was not the warm, bubbly type, but hearing them mock Mark broke something inside me. Mark, who wore the ground Chloe walked on. Mark, who was spending his savings to give her a dream wedding. They called him a fool. They called me a cash cow. The feed continued, but I minimized the video window. I could not watch them kiss. I needed to investigate the second part of Richard's statement. "We are almost at the finish line." What did that mean? I switched to the keylogger data I had collected from Richard's laptop. I traced his login activity to a bank in the Cayman Islands. It was a bank known for its discretion and lack of cooperation with American tax authorities. Using the password he had carelessly saved in his browser, I accessed the account. The numbers on the screen made me gasp. Over the last 18 months, Richard had been systematically draining our joint investment accounts. He had been liquidating assets, stocks, bonds, even the equity from a commercial property we owned downtown, and funneling the cash into a shell company called RC Holdings. From there, the money was moved offshore. I did the mental math quickly. He had moved nearly $4 million. He was not just cheating on me. He was embezzling our life. He was preparing to file for divorce, claim poverty, and leave me with the depreciating assets while he and Chloe lived off my money on a beach somewhere. He planned to leave me with nothing but the house he could not sell and the career he despised. Tears pricked at the corners of my eyes. Hot and angry, I wanted to call the police. I wanted to drive home and burn the house down. I wanted to scream until my throat bled. But then the scientist took over. I closed my eyes and took a deep breath, forcing my pulse to slow down. Emotion is a variable that causes errors. Logic provides solutions. I thought about our prenuptial agreement. It was a document Richard had signed eagerly 10 years ago, back when he was trying to prove he was not marrying me for my inheritance. There was a specific clause, Clause 7b, known as the infidelity penalty. If either party were proven to have committed adultery, they would forfeit all claims to marital assets and would receive zero alimony. Furthermore, if the adultery could be proven to be premeditated or malicious, the cheating spouse would be liable for legal fees and emotional damages. However, the burden of proof was high. A few audio recordings might be dismissed as taken out of context. A video in a home office could be challenged as a violation of privacy if not obtained legally to invoke Clause 7b and destroy him completely. I needed something undeniable. I needed something public. I needed them to be caught in a situation so compromising, so flagrant, that no lawyer in the world could defend them. I looked back at the screen. Richard and Chloe were still in the office, confident in their secrecy, laughing at the destruction they were planning for my brother and me. They were rats in a maze, thinking they had found the cheese. They had no idea that I was the one designing the walls. I would not just divorce Richard. I would not just warn Mark. I would wait. I would let them think they had won, and then I would orchestrate a finale that would cost them everything. I closed the laptop and picked up my phone to text Mark. Hey, just checking in. Hope the suit fitting went well. Dinner at our place this weekend. I hit send. The trap was set. Now I just had to prepare the bait. The human brain is a delicate electrochemical machine. As a chemist, I know that even a microgram of a foreign substance can alter perception, memory, and reality itself. For the past month, I had begun to fear that my machine was breaking down. I was forgetting simple formulas I had known since graduate school. During board meetings at ORAM, the walls of the conference room would seem to breathe, expanding and contracting in the corner of my vision. I felt a constant low-level fog wrapping around my thoughts, making me stumble over words and lose hours of time. Richard was so supportive during these episodes. He would hold my hand, his face etched with practiced concern, and tell me that I was working too hard. He suggested that perhaps the stress of my position was triggering an early onset of the dementia that had plagued my grandmother. He started attending my doctor appointments, speaking over me, describing symptoms I was not sure I had, painting a picture of a woman on the edge of a nervous breakdown. I had started to believe him. I had started to doubt my own sanity. But now, with the knowledge of his infidelity, the lens through which I viewed his care shattered, suspicion is a powerful antidote to confusion. The morning after I discovered the lubricant, Richard handed me my daily regimen of supplements, a ritual he had insisted on taking over 3 months ago to help me optimize my health. I looked at the small ceramic dish. There was a multivitamin, a fish oil capsule, and 2 white oblong pills that he claimed were a high-end herbal blend for cognitive function. "Drink up, darling," he said, kissing my forehead. "You have a big presentation today. You need your focus." I swallowed the water, but palmed the 2 white pills, slipping them into the pocket of my blazer. At ORAM, I did not go to my office. I went straight to the mass spectrometry lab. I ground the white pills into a fine powder and ran a full chemical analysis. I stood there watching the peaks and valleys of the graph appear on the monitor, my blood running cold. The pills were not herbal. They were a synthetic derivative of psilocybin mixed with a mild sedative. It was a cocktail designed to induce confusion, mild visual hallucinations, and memory gaps without causing a full psychedelic trip. They were drugging me. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. This was not just about sex or boredom. This was a systematic dismantling of my mind. Richard was not waiting for a divorce settlement. He was building a case for legal incapacitation. If he could prove I was mentally unstable, he could gain power of attorney, he could commit me to a facility and take control of my entire estate, my voting rights at the company, and my freedom. He did not want to leave me. He wanted to erase me. I sat in the sterile light of the lab, trembling, not from fear, but from a rage so cold it felt like liquid nitrogen. I needed to know the full extent of their depravity. I needed to know if this was Richard's idea or hers. That evening, I found my answer in the living room. Chloe had left her iPad on the coffee table. It was locked, of course, but Chloe was lazy. I noticed greasy fingerprints on the screen, tracing a distinct Z pattern. I replicated the swipe. The device unlocked. She had left her Notes app open. It was functioning as a digital diary, synced to the cloud, a testament to her narcissism. She documented everything: her shopping sprees with Richard's stolen money, her mockery of my fashion sense, and their detailed timeline. I scrolled back 3 months. The Ice Queen took the bait today. One entry read, "She thinks she's just tired. Richard is amazing. He swapped the bottles perfectly. By Christmas, we will have her in the padded room at St. Mary's." I already picked out the redecoration plans for the master bedroom. Goodbye, beige, a low velvet. My stomach turned, but I forced myself to keep reading. I needed to see if Mark was safe. I scrolled to an entry dated 2 weeks ago titled "The Brother Problem." "Mark is becoming annoying," K.H. Lowe had written. "He wants to use the wedding money for a down payment on a house. As if I am going to live in a suburb with him. Richard says we have to keep him sweet until the wedding. But after we can't have him sniffing around when Hannah is locked up. Richard knows a guy who can arrange a car accident. Nothing fatal, just enough to break a few legs or maybe a spinal injury. If Mark is crippled, Hannah will be too distraught to fight the conservatorship. She will collapse completely. 2 birds, 1 stone." I dropped the iPad onto the sofa cushion as if it were a venomous snake. The air in the room felt suddenly thin. I gasped for breath. They were not just thieves. They were not just cheaters. They were monsters. They were planning to physically maim my sweet, naive brother just to accelerate my mental decline. They viewed Mark as collateral damage, a pond to be broken to secure their payday. I looked at my reflection in the darkened window. The woman staring back at me was no longer the confused, tired wife. She was something ancient and terrifying. For weeks they had been gaslighting me, manipulating my reality to make me feel small and crazy. They wanted a crazy woman. I would give them one, but not the one they expected. I carefully wiped the iPad screen with the hem of my shirt to remove my prints and placed it back exactly where I found it. I went to the kitchen and retrieved the bottle of hallucinogens from the back of the pantry where Richard hid them. I did not flush them. I did not throw them away. I palmed the pills every morning, pretending to swallow them, but instead I stored them in a sealed vial hidden in my lab. I replaced the ones in his bottle with aspirin lookalikes only when I knew he was watching. But tonight I made sure the bottle in his bag was the original, full of the poison he intended for me. From now on, I would be taking aspirin. My mind would be sharp. My focus would be razor thin, but I would continue to act the part. I would feign the headaches. I would pretend to forget names. I would let them think their poison was working, lulling them into a false sense of security. They wanted to destroy my mind, to get my money. I decided then and there that I would not just stop them. I was going to use my mind, my clear, brilliant, scientific mind, to dismantle their lives piece by piece. I would not just divorce Richard. I would not just expose Chloe. I would ruin them so thoroughly that they would wish they had never learned to spell my name. The time for observation was over. The experiment had moved to the volatility phase, and I was about to become the most unstable element in their universe. The Oram facility at 2 in the morning is a cathedral of silence and steel, while the rest of the city slept, or in Richard and Chloe's case, likely plotted my demise. I swiped my security badge at the heavy blast doors of Sector 4. This was my domain. The air here was scrubbed clean, smelling of ozone and sterilized glass, a stark contrast to the cloying scent of deception that had permeated my home. I walked past the rows of dormant centrifuges and mass spectrometers, my heels clicking rhythmically against the epoxy floor. I was not here tonight as a corporate director. I was here as an architect of justice. In my pocket, I carried a small plastic vial containing a sample I had extracted from the lubricant tube in Richard's gym bag earlier that evening. I placed it under the fume hood and began my analysis. The first step was to deconstruct the enemy. I needed to know exactly what Richard and Chloe were using so I could create a counterfeit so perfect that they would never suspect a thing until it was too late. I ran the sample through the gas chromatograph. The results appeared on my monitor in waves of green light. It was a high-grade silicone base with traces of aloe and vitamin E. I noted the viscosity, the specific gravity, and the refractive index. It was clear, slippery, and stayed wet under friction. I dipped a glass rod into the sample, lifting it to check the drip rate. It flowed like warm honey. I memorized the consistency. Then I turned to the locked climate-controlled vault at the back of the lab. This was where we stored the prototypes, the dangerous compounds that were still years away from FDA approval or patent registration. I keyed in my override code and the heavy door hissed open. I bypassed the shelves of agricultural pesticides and pharmaceutical precursors and went straight to the industrial adhesive section. I pulled out a heavy canister labeled Project Leviathan. Technically, the substance inside was a cyanocrylate hybrid we were developing for the Navy. It was designed for deep-sea salvage operations, specifically for patching hull breaches on submarines under extreme pressure. We called it Hologrip 5000 in the lab, but that name did not do justice to its horrifying efficiency. I poured a measure of the raw adhesive into a beaker. In its current state, it was a thick blue paste that smelled like burning rubber. That would not do. I needed to refine it. I set up a distillation apparatus, heating the compound to strip away the colorants and the odor markers. It took 2 hours of careful monitoring, watching the temperature gauge hover at exactly 300 C. When it cooled, the liquid was as clear as water and completely odorless. But the most critical modification was the trigger mechanism. Regular superglue dries upon contact with air. That was too fast. If it dried the moment they applied it, they would know something was wrong immediately. I needed a delay. I needed them to be fully committed to the act before the trap sprang. I added a retarding agent to the mixture, a thermal reactive polymer that remained inert at room temperature. It would only begin its cross-linking process when exposed to temperatures above 98 F. Human body temperature combined with the kinetic energy of friction. I tested a small drop on a synthetic skin pad, rubbing it rhythmically with a heated probe. For the first 4 minutes and 50 seconds, it remained slick, indistinguishable from the luxury lubricant Richard preferred. It was smooth. It was silky. Then the timer hit the 5-minute mark. On the screen of the electron microscope, the molecular structure shifted violently. The polymers uncoiled and hooked into the microscopic textures of the synthetic skin. In real time, the liquid seized. It did not just dry. It fused. It became a solid rubberized bond that was stronger than the material it was attached to. I tried to pull the probe away from the pad. It was immovable. I applied 50 lb of force. The synthetic skin tore around the bond, but the bond itself held firm. It was perfect. I looked at the beaker of clear liquid. It was a weapon of mass humiliation. Once this compound set, it was impervious to water, soap, oil, or alcohol. Richard and Chloe could scrub until they bled, but they would never get it off. Of course, I was not a murderer. I did not want them attached forever, just long enough to ruin them. I moved to a separate station to synthesize the antidote. The Polygrip 5000 had only one chemical weakness, a highly specific solvent based on a volatile organic compound we used to clean industrial vats. I mixed a small batch of the solvent, diluting it with a numbing agent because the chemical reaction of dissolving the glue generated significant heat. Even with the numbing agent, the separation process would feel like a chemical burn. It would be excruciating. I bottled the solvent in a plain medical vial and labeled it Solution B. I placed it in my purse. This was my insurance policy, the key that only I possessed. By the time I finished, the sun was beginning to bleed through the blinds of the east-facing windows. I poured the modified Polygrip 5000 into a syringe. I drove home in the gray light of dawn, the adrenaline keeping me awake. The house was quiet. Richard was asleep, snoring softly, dreaming of his stolen millions. I crept into the master bathroom and retrieved the gym bag. With the steady hands of a surgeon, I removed the expensive lubricant tube. I used the syringe to extract the remaining genuine product, emptying the tube completely. Then I injected my creation. I filled the tube to the exact weight it had been before. I even added a single drop of midnight rose perfume oil that I had purchased online just to ensure the scent profile was identical to what they were used to. I screwed the cap back on, wiping away any fingerprints. I placed the tube back in the secret compartment of the bag. It was done. The weapon was armed and loaded. Later that morning, as I drank my coffee and pretended to read the news on my tablet, I looked over the schedule for the weekend. The engagement party for Mark and Chloe was in 2 days. It was going to be the social event of the season. We had rented a marquee for the lawn, catered by the best chef in Seattle, and invited over 500 guests, including Richard's business partners, local politicians, and the press. It was the perfect stage. "Richard," I called out as he walked into the kitchen, looking refreshed and dangerously handsome. "Yes, darling," he asked, pouring himself a glass of orange juice. "I was thinking about the party on Saturday," I said, keeping my voice light and breezy. "Since the contractors are still working on the security system in the East Wing, maybe we should lock the master bedroom. We do not want guests wandering in." Richard paused, the glass halfway to his mouth. I saw the gears turning in his head. He was thinking exactly what I wanted him to think. A locked room, a forbidden zone, a thrill. "Do not worry about it," he said with a wink that made my skin crawl. "I will make sure the door is secure. No one will disturb us." He had no idea how right he was. No one would disturb them, and once they were inside, no one would be able to help them either. I took a sip of my black coffee. It tasted bitter, but the aftertaste was incredibly sweet. Saturday arrived wrapped in gold leaf indissection. If there is one thing the Seattle upper crust enjoys more than hoarding wealth, it is pretending to be virtuous while doing it. The engagement party for Mark and Chloe was a masterclass in this specific brand of theater. We had transformed the sprawling lawn of our lakeside estate into a scene from a fairy tale, complete with white silk mares, imported orchids that cost more than a mid-sized sedan, and a string quartet playing soft, innocuous classical music that floated over the chatter of 500 guests. I stood at the top of the stone staircase overlooking the garden, smoothing the fabric of my emerald green gown. It was a strategic color choice. Green is the color of envy, of money, and of the toxic sludge I deal with in the lab. Beside me, Richard adjusted his cufflinks. He looked the part of the benevolent patriarch, the self-made millionaire graciously hosting his wife's less fortunate family. He flashed his teeth at a passing senator, his hand resting possessively on the small of my back. To the untrained eye, it was a gesture of affection. To me, it felt like a brand. "Showtime, darling," he murmured, his voice dripping with the charm he used to close deals. "Try to look a little less clinical today. It is a celebration after all." "I am overflowing with joy," I replied, my voice flat. "Can you not tell?" We descended into the fray. The air smelled of expensive perfume, roast duck, and hypocrisy. I navigated the crowd with the precision of a shark in a koi pond, accepting compliments on the decor and the food. Every smile I offered was a calculated muscle contraction. Every laugh was a sound effect. I found Mark near the Champagne Tower. My brother looked devastatingly handsome in his tuxedo, but it was his expression that broke my heart. He looked like a man who had won the lottery without realizing the ticket was counterfeit. He was beaming, his eyes scanning the crowd constantly for Chloe as if she were the sun and he was a planet caught in her gravity. "Hannah," he exclaimed, pulling me into a crushing hug. "Can you believe this? It is too much. You and Richard did not have to do all this. You deserve the best, Mark," I said, squeezing his hand. I meant it. He deserved the truth, and I was going to give it to him, even if it destroyed him first. Then the bride-to-be appeared. Chloe was wearing a dress that was technically white, but clung to her body with a desperation that screamed for attention. It was cut low enough to be scandalous and high enough to be expensive. She was surrounded by a gaggle of her friends, women who looked like carbon copies of her, all high cheekbones and empty eyes. I approached them holding a small velvet box. The chatter died down. "Chloe," I said, pitching my voice to carry to the nearby guests, "welcome to the family properly." I opened the box to reveal a diamond tennis bracelet. It was platinum, set with 5 carat of floorless stones. I had bought it yesterday using Richard's credit card, the one linked to the account he thought I did not know about. It cost $25,000. K.H. Lowe's eyes widened, the avarice flashing nakedly across her face before she masked it with a performative gasp. "Oh, Hanner," she squealed, letting me clasp it around her wrist. "It is stunning. Thank you so much. I promise I will take good care of Mark." "I know you will." I smiled, a predator showing its teeth. "You seem to appreciate the value of things." Throughout the next hour, I played the perfect hostess. I made sure the investors' glasses were full. I introduced Mark to people who could help his career, though I knew he was too distracted to network. But my real focus was on the subtle electromagnetic field between Richard and Chloe. They were careful. I had to give them that. They never stood next to each other for more than 30 seconds. But I saw the signs, a lingering glance across the buffet table, the way Richard would subconsciously check his watch every time Khlo laughed. The tension between them was palpable, a buildup of kinetic energy waiting for a release. I checked the time. It was 8:00. The sun had set, and the garden lights had flickered on, casting long romantic shadows. It was time to bait the trap. I found Richard near the bar swirling a glass of scotch. He looked bored. "Richard," I whispered, stepping into his personal space. I leaned in close, feigning intimacy. "I need a favor. The caterers are having a crisis with the dessert station, and I need to supervise the setup for the next 2 hours. I am going to be stuck in the kitchen tent." "Tragic," he drawled, taking a sip. "Do not work too hard." Also, I lowered my voice further, glancing around conspiratorially. "I think Khlo is having a bit of a panic attack. I saw her looking very flushed near the fountain. She is probably overwhelmed by all these people. Mark is too busy being the center of attention to notice. Maybe you could check on her. Give her a pep talk. You're so good at calming people down." Richard's eyes flickered. I saw the thought process execute in real time. Wife busy for 2 hours. Brother-in-law distracted. Mistress vulnerable and waiting. "I suppose I should be the good brother-in-law," he said, trying to suppress a smirk. "Where is she?" "I think she went towards the house to find a quiet bathroom." I lied smoothly. "Oh, and honey, just so you know, the security team is doing a firmware update on the sensors in the East Wing tonight. The whole system is down in the master suite until tomorrow morning. So, if you need a private place to talk to her where no one will interrupt, the master bedroom is the quietest spot in the house. The library is full of your cigar buddies. The East Wing our bedroom, the place I had rigged to be a prison." Richard nodded, finding indifference, but his pulse was visible in his neck. "Good to know. I will make sure she is okay." "Thank you, darling," I said, patting his chest right over his treacherous heart. "You are a saint." I walked away, heading towards the catering tent. I waited in the shadows of a large oak tree, watching. 2 minutes later, Richard set his glass down and walked towards the house, loosening his tie slightly. 3 minutes after that, I saw Chloe detach herself from her group of friends. She checked her phone, doubtless reading a text from Richard, and slipped away towards the side entrance, moving with the stealth of a cat. I looked over at Mark. He was laughing at a joke someone had told, raising his champagne flute in a toast. He looked so happy. He had no idea that the two people he trusted most in the world were currently walking up the grand staircase to defile his future. I pulled my phone out of my clutch. I opened the app that controlled my smart home system. The status of the master bedroom door sensor turned from closed to open and then back to closed. Motion detected. 2 subjects. They were inside. I waited. I needed them to get comfortable. I needed them to feel safe. I needed them to reach for the bag. I walked into the catering tent and started shouting orders about the solids, making sure at least a dozen witnesses saw me yelling at the chef about the temperature of the chocolate. I was creating an ironclad alibi while my husband and his mistress were sealing their own fate. The countdown had begun. The glow of my smartphone screen was the only source of truth in a garden filled with lies. To the casual observer, I was just another bored hostess checking her messages, perhaps coordinating with the valet service or checking the weather forecast. I stood near the edge of the rose garden, the heavy bass of the jazz band vibrating through the soles of my heels. In reality, I was watching a live feed of my own bedroom broadcasting the final act of a tragedy I had written, directed, and produced. On the screen, a high-definition camera I had hidden in the smoke detector provided a perfect bird's-eye view of the master suite. The room was bathed in the soft, ambient light of the bedside lamps, which Richard had just turned on. He looked smug. He tossed his tuxedo jacket onto the chaise lounge with a careless disregard that made my teeth grind. Chloe followed him in, giggling, kicking off her heels and leaving them where they fell on my Persian rug. "God, this room is so depressing," K.H. Lowe said, her voice tinny through my earbuds. She spun around, taking in the beige and cream tones I had carefully curated. "It smells like old money and boredom. When we move in, I am tearing all of this out. I want mirrors on the ceiling, Richard, and maybe a leopard print rug." "You can have whatever you want, babe," Richard replied, loosening his tie and moving toward her. "Once the deal is done and Hannah is out of the picture, this whole house is your playground. But for now, let's christen the bed, shall we? I have been wanting to do this ever since we bought the place." I took a slow, deliberate sip of my wine. The audacity was breathtaking. They were not just desecrating my marriage. They were already redecorating my home in their minds. Richard walked over to the gym bag he had accidentally left on the bench earlier that day. He unzipped the side pocket and pulled out the tube. My breath hitched in my throat. It was the moment of truth. He looked at the tube, flipped the cap open, and squeezed a generous amount of the clear gel onto his palm. He rubbed his hands together. "New formula?" Chloe asked, glancing at the tube. "Same brand, just a fresh bottle," Richard said, tossing the tube onto the nightstand. "Smells good, right? Like that perfume you wear." Midnight rose, she purred. "You are so thoughtful." I checked the timer on my watch. 0 minutes. I watched as they fell onto the bed, a tangle of limbs and deceit. I forced myself to watch, not out of masochism, but out of scientific necessity. I needed to verify the contact points. I needed to ensure the thermal reaction was initiated. The Polygrip 5000 required sustained body heat and friction to begin the cross-linking process. 1 minute passed. They were laughing, whispering cruel things about Mark and me between kisses. The gel was doing exactly what it was designed to do in its initial phase, lubricating, smoothing, facilitating their betrayal. They had no idea that the molecules between their bodies were already beginning to wake up, sensing the heat, preparing to lock. 3 minutes passed. I looked up from my phone and smiled at a passing waiter. "The crab cakes are excellent," I told him. "Please make sure my brother gets one." 5 minutes. The threshold had been reached. The retarding agent in the chemical compound would have neutralized by now. The bonding phase was beginning. It was time to close the cage. I opened the security app on my phone. My thumb hovered over a red icon labeled Master Suite Lockdown. This was a custom protocol I had programmed into the system myself. It did not just lock the door. It engaged heavy-duty steel deadbolts on the main door, the bathroom door, and the balcony access. It also lowered the hurricane-proof shutters over the windows, sealing the room completely. I pressed the button through the earbuds. I heard the heavy mechanical thud-thud-thud of the locks engaging in rapid succession. It sounded like a prison cell slamming shut on the screen. Richard paused. He looked toward the door. "What was that?" Chloe asked, her voice breathless. "Just the security system," Richard said, though he sounded uncertain. "Hannah said they were doing maintenance. It probably just reset. Ignore it." He tried to move to adjust his position. That was when the first variable shifted on the screen. I saw Richard frown. He tried to pull back to create distance between his body and hers. He could not. "Wait," he grunted. "Hang on a second." "What are you doing?" Chloe complained. "Do not stop." "I am trying to move," Richard said, his voice rising in pitch. "It is sticky, really sticky. The Polygrip 5000 does not set like ordinary glue. It does not crack or flake. It becomes a unified rubberized mass that mimics the elasticity of skin, but possesses the tensile strength of steel. The more they moved, the more the friction accelerated the curing process. Richard pulled harder. I saw the skin on K.H. Lowe's hip stretch unnaturally, pulling with him. Chloe shrieked. "Richard, stop. You are hurting me. You are pulling my skin." "I am not trying to," Richard yelled back, panic bleeding into his tone. "I can't. I can't get off. It is like we are fused together. What did you use? Chloe screamed, batting at his chest. Get off me. It burns. It is the same stuff I always use, Richard shouted. He braced his hands against the mattress and heaved backward with all his strength. The result was catastrophic. The bond held firm, but the surrounding tissue did not. They both screamed in unison, a raw, guttural sound of pure agony. The glue had set completely. They were no longer two people. They were a single biological entity joined at the most sensitive point of contact. Oh my God! Chloe sobbed, her hands flailing uselessly. It is stuck! It is stuck! Get it off! Get it off! I am trying! Richard roared. He reached down, trying to pry them apart with his hands, but his hands were covered in the residue from when he applied the gel. As soon as he touched his own thigh and K.H. Lowe's stomach to get leverage, his fingers began to bond to the skin there, too. I watched in cold fascination. It was a chain reaction of stupidity. Every attempt to free themselves only created more points of adhesion. Richard's left hand was now glued to his own thigh. K.H. Lowe's right hand, which he had used to push against his chest, was now sticking to his pectoral muscle. They were becoming a grotesque statue of infidelity. Call someone, K.H. Lowe screamed, her voice bordering on hysteria. Richard, get your phone. Richard strained to reach the nightstand where he had tossed his phone. He stretched his arm out, his body contorted in pain. His fingertips brushed the device, but he could not grab it. He was tethered to her. I can't reach it, he yelled. The door. Go to the door. I can't walk, she wailed. If we move, it feels like my skin is ripping off. We have to try, Richard commanded. I watched them struggle to coordinate their movements. Like a three-legged race from hell, they shimmied inches across the bed, screaming with every small motion. They finally rolled off the edge of the mattress and hit the floor with a heavy thud. Tangled in the sheets, limbs splayed, completely inseparable. They were trapped. They were naked. They were in agonizing pain. And they were locked inside a soundproofed room with hurricane shutters down. I closed the app on my phone and slipped it into my clutch. I took a deep breath of the cool evening air. The scent of jasmine and roses was sweet, but the scent of victory was intoxicating. I turned back to the party. The band was playing a waltz. I spotted Mark across the lawn looking for me. It was time for the second act. The private screening was over. It was time to invite the audience. Mark, I called out, waving my hand and putting on my best mask of concern. Mark, have you seen Richard? I thought I heard a noise from the house. The trap had not just sprung. It had crushed them, and the night was still young. The jazz band was playing a smooth, lulling rendition of a classic standard. The saxophone notes drifting over the manicured lawn like smoke. Waiters in white tuxedo jackets wove through the crowd of 500 guests, topping off glasses of vintage champagne. The atmosphere was one of cultivated boredom and expensive leisure. To my left, a senator was laughing at a joke made by a tech CEO. To my right, my parents were boasting to a real estate developer about Richard's business acumen. It was a perfect crystalline bubble of high society, and I was holding the needle. I stood near the periphery of the patio, my phone in my hand. The app was open to the audio control panel of the smart home system. I had already isolated the input feed from the master bedroom's high-sensitivity ceiling microphones. These mics were originally installed for voice command automation, capable of picking up a whisper from across the room. Now, they were picking up something far more primal. With a tap of my thumb, I selected the output zone garden. All speakers. I slid the volume fader to maximum. 1 second, the garden was filled with the gentle rhythmic brushing of drums and the hum of polite conversation. The next second, the night was torn apart. Our God, stop moving. You are tearing me apart. The voice belonged to Richard. It boomed out of the 20 surround sound speakers hidden in the landscaping rocks and hung from the oak trees. It was amplified to a deafening decibel level, distorting slightly at the edges but unmistakable in its agony. The band stopped playing instantly. The saxophonist lowered his instrument, his mouth hanging open. 500 heads snapped up in unison. Conversation died. A heavy, stunned silence fell over the lawn, only to be broken immediately by another scream, this one higher and shriller. It burns. Oh my God, Richard. It is stuck. Get it out. Get it off. K.H. Lowe's voice echoed across the lake, bouncing off the water. The clarity was terrifying. Every sob, every gasp for air, was broadcast in high definition. I can't. Richard's voice roared back, sounding guttural and panicked. It is like super blue. We are fused. Do not pull away. The crowd stood frozen. People were exchanging bewildered, terrified glances. The context was missing, and in that void, their imaginations ran wild. Was it a torture session? A medical emergency? A violent assault? I waited exactly 3 seconds, just long enough for the horror to set in before I dropped my champagne flute. It shattered on the flagstone patio, the sound crisp and jarring. "Richard!" I screamed, throwing my hands over my mouth. I widened my eyes, channeling every ounce of panic I could muster. "That is Richard and Chloe. Oh my God! Someone is hurting them." Mark, who had been standing near the buffet table holding a plate of canapes, dropped the plate. His face went white. He sprinted toward me, his eyes wild with fear. "Hannah, did you hear that?" "What is happening?" he shouted, grabbing my shoulders. "I do not know," I wailed, pointing a trembling hand toward the house. "It sounds like are they tracked? Is there a fire? We have to help them. Help me, somebody. Help us." K.H. Lowe's amplified scream ripped through the air again, sounding ragged and desperate. "It hurts so much. Call 911. A woman in a red dress shouted. "No, we have to get them out now," I yelled back, taking charge of the chaos. "Mark, come with me, Dad. Everyone." I hiked up the skirt of my emerald gown and ran toward the French doors leading into the main house. Mark was right on my heels, followed closely by our parents, Richard's business partners, and a surging wave of morbidly curious guests. The herd instinct took over. No one wanted to miss the disaster. We thundered through the hallway, a stampede of expensive shoes on hardwood floors. I could hear the panting of the people behind me, the murmurs of confusion and fear. "Is there an intruder?" my father asked, puffing as he ran beside me. "I bet it is a kidnapping attempt," the senator speculated loudly from behind. We reached the double doors of the master suite. The hallway was crowded now, packed with at least 50 of the most influential people in the state, all jostling to see what was happening. The screaming was no longer coming from the speakers, but was muffled through the heavy mahogany doors. It sounded wet and frantic. "Richard, Mark is here." "We are coming," Mark yelled, pounding his fist against the wood. He tried the handle. It was locked tight. "It is locked." "Hannah, do you have the key?" "The keypad," I gasped, finding hyperventilation. "I can open it with the code." I stepped up to the digital keypad mounted on the wall. My hands were shaking a deliberate affectation. I knew the code. It was my birthday. But I also knew that the longer this went on, the more damning it would be. I punched in 4 random numbers. Beep, beep, beep. Access denied. The red light flashed. "Damn it," I cried out. "I am too nervous." My hands are shaking from inside the room. Richard heard us. "Mark Hare," he screamed, his voice cracking. "Do not come in. Stay out. Call an ambulance, but do not open the door." The crowd fell silent for a heartbeat. That was not the cry of a man being murdered. That was the cry of a man trying to hide something. "He is delirious from the pain," I shouted, overriding his plea. "We can't leave them in there. Try the code again. Just open it, Hannah." Mark roared, panic making him aggressive. I punched in another wrong code. Beep, beep, beep. Access denied. "Richard, stop pulling." K.H. Lowe shrieked from inside, close to the door now. It sounded like they had dragged themselves onto the floor. "You are ripping my skin. It is bleeding. Oh God, look at us. We are monsters." The guests in the hallway exchanged glances. The narrative was shifting. "Look at us. Do not come in." The fear was turning into suspicion. "What does she mean? Look at us." A socialite whispered loudly. "One more time," I said, taking a deep breath. "Please work, please." I punched in the correct code this time, but I did not hit the enter key immediately. I held my finger over the button, looking at Mark. He looked terrified, ready to charge into fire to save his fiancée and his brother-in-law. My poor sweet brother. This was going to hurt him. but it was the only surgery that would cut out the cancer. Open the door. Hannah, my mother, screamed. I pressed enter. Chime. Access granted. The heady deadbolts retracted with a loud mechanical clank that echoed like a gunshot in the silent hallway. The door clicked open a fraction of an inch. I stepped back, clearing the stage. Mark, I said softly, my voice dropping the hysterical pitch. You go first. Mark did not hesitate. He kicked the door open, swinging it wide to reveal the interior of the master bedroom. The hallway light flooded into the dim room. The first thing that hit us was the smell, a mix of sweat, fear, and the cloying, unmistakable scent of midnight rose perfume. And then we saw them. The crowd gasped as one entity. It was a sound of pure shock, a collective inhalation of air that sucked the oxygen out of the corridor. Richard and K.H. Lowe were on the floor near the foot of the bed. They were tangled in the Egyptian cotton sheets, but the sheets did not cover enough. They were stark naked, and they were pressed together in a way that defied anatomy, chest to chest, pelvis to pelvis. Their limbs spread out like a broken spider. They looked up at the doorway, their faces masks of sheer terror. They were red-faced, sweating profusely and crying. Mark whispered. The word fell out of his mouth like a stone. Richard squeezed his eyes shut, letting out a moan of defeat. Chloe tried to cover her face with her hand, but her hand was stuck to Richard's pectoral muscle, so she only succeeded in dragging his torso slightly to the left, eliciting a yelp of pain from him. Don't look. Richard croaked, his voice ruined. Get out, everyone. Get out. But no one moved. The camera phones were already coming out. The flashes began to pop, illuminating their shame in blinding bursts of white light. I stood behind Mark, watching the scene I had orchestrated. It was gruesome, it was tragic, and it was absolutely perfect. The blinding white light of camera flashes turned the master bedroom into a strobe-lit nightmare. If the hallway had been a stage, this was the grand finale, and the audience was voracious. The door was wide open, and the 50 people closest to the threshold were no longer guests. They were witnesses to a catastrophe that was equal parts biological and social. The scene on the floor was not erotic. It was medical, grotesque, and deeply pathetic. Richard and Chloe were a tangle of limbs and panic, illuminated mercilessly by the chandelier and the hallway spillover. They were writhing, but their movements were restricted by the invisible, terrified bond that held them together. The Polygrip 5000 had done its work with terrifying efficiency. Their skin at the points of contact, chest to chest, thigh to thigh, was not just touching. It was fused. The flesh around the bond was angry, swollen, and bright red, distended from their frantic, muscular efforts to pull apart. They looked like a single malfunctioning organism, a two-headed beast of betrayal that was suffering in real time. Mark stood in the doorway, frozen. The champagne flute he had been holding slipped from his fingers. It hit the hardwood floor and shattered, the crystal exploding outward. The sound was sharp and final, cutting through the murmurs of the crowd like a guillotine blade. He did not blink. He just stared, his face draining of all color until he looked like a ghost. He looked at the man he had idolized as a mentor. He looked at the woman he had planned to marry in 3 months, and he saw them naked, joined in an act that was undeniable. The betrayal was absolute. It was not a rumor. It was not a text message. It was a physical reality that he could smell and see. Mark, Richard croaked, lifting his head from the floor. His face was a mask of sweat and terror. He tried to reach out a hand toward Mark, but his arm was pinned at an awkward angle by K.H. Lowe's shoulder. Mark, listen to me. It is not what it looks like. We were just talking and fell. It is a medical condition. It was the stupidest lie I had ever heard, born of pure desperation. Shut up, Chloe wailed, burying her face against Richard's neck because she physically could not turn her head away. Just shut up. Richard, throw us a blanket. Someone cover us, but no one moved to help. The shock was too potent. Instead, the phones came up higher. I spotted a well-known lifestyle blogger in the front row, a young woman named Jessica, who had been live streaming the party decor earlier. Her phone was held high. The camera lens pointed directly at the floor. The little red recording light was steady. I knew that within seconds, this image was being beamed to hundreds of thousands of followers. The hashtags would be brutal. Crestwood scandal stuck together. Calmer. The security team finally pushed their way through the throng of guests. Two burly men in black suits burst into the room, looking ready to tackle an intruder. Instead, they skidded to a halt, their jaws dropping as they assessed the situation. "Mr. Prestwood," the lead guard asked, his voice wavering. He looked around for a threat, but the only threat was the chemistry between the two lovers. "Do not just stand there, you idiots!" Richard screamed, his voice cracking with humiliation. "Get a towel. Get a doctor. Get these people out of here." One of the guards quickly grabbed a decorative throw blanket from the armchair and moved to drape it over them. But because of the awkward split angle of their legs and the way they were glued, the blanket kept sliding off. It was a farce. Every time they tried to adjust, they screamed in pain as the glue tugged at their sensitive skin. "Oh, stop touching us!" Chloe shrieked at the guard. "It feels like my skin is ripping off." The guard backed away, hands raised in surrender. "Sir, I do not know what to do. You seem to be adhered." "Adhered?" Richard spat the word out. "We are glued. You someone put glue on the bed." That was my cue. I stepped through the crowd, the sea of expensive tuxedos and gowns parting for me. I walked with a steady, measured pace, the heels of my shoes clicking on the floorboards. I did not run to them. I did not cry. I did not scream. I was the director of RD at RM, and I was inspecting a failed experiment. I stopped 3 FT away from them. I looked down. Richard looked up at me, his eyes pleading, begging for me to save him, to be the beautiful wife who fixes his messes. He expected anger. He expected tears. He did not expect ice. I tilted my head to the side, studying the bond on their torsos with clinical detachment. "Well," I said, my voice calm and carrying clearly over the sobbing and the camera shutters. "I must say, Richard, when you said you wanted to be closer to the family, I did not think you meant it quite this literally." "Inner," Richard gasped. "Help me, please. It hurts. I think the skin is tearing. It certainly looks painful," I observed, crossing my arms over my chest. "It looks like an industrial adhesive, probably a cyanocrylate hybrid with a thermal setting agent, very difficult to remove, practically permanent without the right solvent." Chloe looked up at me, her mascara running in black streaks down her face. "You did this," she hissed, though her voice lacked any real power. "You crazy witch. You did this." I raised an eyebrow. "I have been in the garden with 500 witnesses for the last 2 hours. Chloe, you are the one who decided to sneak into my locked bedroom and roll around in my husband's gym bag supplies. If you play with unknown chemicals, you have to expect a reaction." I turned to the crowd, addressing them like a tour guide at a museum. "Ladies and gentlemen," I announced, my voice steady, "I apologize for the disruption to the evening. It appears my husband and my brother's fiancé have found themselves in a rather sticky situation. Please give them some space. I believe the fire department will need to use the jaws of life or perhaps a scalpel to separate them." The crowd erupted into fresh murmurs. I heard a few stifled laughs. The spell of Richard's power was broken. He was no longer the intimidating tycoon. He was a naked man glued to a 23-year-old on the floor of his own bedroom. Mark finally moved. He walked past me, stepping close to Richard. He looked down at the man who had promised to make him a partner in the firm. "You called me an idiot," Mark said, his voice quiet and trembling with rage. "I heard you on the phone last week. You called me a useful idiot." Richard's eyes widened. "Mark, no. I never. And you—" Mark turned his gaze to K.H. Lowe. "You are not a victim. You are just cheap." Mark turned on his heel and walked out of the room, pushing past the cameras, leaving his engagement ring metaphorically in the dust. "Mark, wait." K.H. Lowe screamed, struggling to lift her head. The sound of sirens began to wail in the distance, getting louder. The ambulance and the police were approaching. "Richard," I said, leaning down slightly so only he could hear me clearly amidst the noise, "I hope it was worth it, because looking at the live stream numbers on that girl's phone over there, I would say about 50,000 people have seen your assets in the last 5 minutes, or and stock might take a hit tomorrow, but your personal brand that is utterly bankrupt." Richard stared at me, the realization of his total destruction finally sinking in. He stopped fighting the glue. He stopped screaming. He just lay there defeated, naked, and permanently attached to his mistake. "Get everyone out," he whispered. "A broken man." "Oh, I will," I said, straightening up and smoothing my dress. "But the police are coming, Richard, and they are going to want to know why there are lethal hallucinogens in your nightstand. I am afraid this night is only going to get longer for you." I turned and walked out of the room, leaving the door wide open behind me. The flashing lights of the ambulance reflected off the hallway walls, painting the scene in chaotic bursts of red and white. I walked toward the front entrance to greet the paramedics. I had a very specific solvent to hand over, but I was in no rush. Let them soak in the consequences for a few more minutes. Science, after all, cannot be rushed. The arrival of the emergency services transformed my home from a high society venue into a biohazard zone. The wail of sirens cut through the cool night air, drowning out the murmurs of the guests who, despite their breeding, refused to leave. They lingered near the driveway and the front lawn, morbid voyeurs waiting for the encore. Police officers in tactical gear were the first to storm the master's suite, weapons drawn, shouting commands. They had been dispatched under a code red protocol for a potential chemical attack. What they found, however, was not a terrorist plot, but a domestic farce. The tension in the room deflated instantly, replaced by confused professionalism. Two paramedics, a young man and an older woman, knelt beside the writhing couple. I stood back against the wall, observing the triage process. "Sir, ma'am, try to remain calm," the older paramedic said, snapping on blue latex gloves. "We need to assess the bond." "Where exactly is the adhesion?" "Everywhere." Richard screamed, his face a mottled purple from exertion and shame. "Chest, stomach, thighs." "It is burning." "Just cut it off." The paramedic touched the seam where Richard's skin met KH Lowe's. She tried to insert a tone depressor to test the seal. It did not even slide in a millimeter. "It is fused tight," she announced, looking up at her partner. "The tissue around the bond is already edematous. If we try to separate them here with a scalpel, we will cause massive hemorrhaging and skin avulsion. We cannot do it on sight." "What do you mean?" Chloe wailed. "You cannot take us out like this." "We have no choice." "Miss," the paramedic replied briskly, "we have to transport you as a single unit. We need the oversized gurney." The logistics of moving two full-grown adults glued together in a lover's embrace are undignified in the extreme. They had to be rolled onto a heavy-duty tarp, then lifted by 4 officers onto a gurney designed for bariatric patients. Because of their positioning face to face, they could not be covered effectively. The blanket kept sliding off their sweating, moving bodies. The journey from the bedroom to the ambulance was the longest walk of shame in the history of Seattle society. I followed them out. As the gurney rattled down the grand staircase, Richard tried to hide his face in KH Lowe's shoulder, but there was nowhere to hide. We exited the front doors and into the glare of floodlights. 500 people watched in silence. The only sound was the rattle of the gurney wheels on the cobblestone driveway. Every eye was fixed on the spectacle. My neighbors, Richard's investors, the press, they all saw the president of Crestwood Real Estate strapped to his mistress like a biology experiment gone wrong. I saw the flashes of cameras. I saw the live stream of the bloggers still running. This was not just a scandal. It was a legacy-ending event. I climbed into the front passenger seat of the ambulance. "I am the wife," I told the driver calmly, "and I'm a chemist. I might be able to help at the hospital." The ride to Seattle. Grace was tense in the back. Richard and Chloe argued in hushed, venomous tones, blaming each other for the catastrophe. I stared out the window, watching the city lights blur by, my mind already calculating the next phase. When we arrived at the emergency room, the trauma team was waiting. They wheeled the couple into Trauma Bay 2. The bright fluorescent lights left nothing to the imagination. A team of 6 doctors and nurses surrounded them, poking and prodding the adhesive. "I have never seen a bond this strong," the attending physician muttered, shining a pen light on the connection. "It is hydrophobic and heat-resistant. Saline does nothing. Alcohol does nothing. We might have to surgically excise the skin." "No surgery," Richard shouted. "Do not cut me, doctor," I said, stepping forward. I reached into my purse and pulled out a flash drive and a printed chemical abstract. "My husband is an amateur chemist. He likes to experiment with industrial compounds in the garage. I found this file on his laptop earlier. I believe it is the formula for the adhesive he used. I handed the papers to the doctor. It was, of course, the formula I had synthesized, but the metadata had been scrubbed and replaced with Richard's digital signature. "And this," I said, producing the vial of solvent I had prepared, was sitting right next to the glue. "It is labeled antidote. I think he made it in case something like this happened." The doctor looked at me with relief. "Thank you, Mrs. Crestwood. You just saved them a lot of skin grafts." He turned to the nurse. "Get this to the lab for a quick verification, then prep the area. Warning, the notes here say, the reaction is exothermic. This is going to get very hot before it releases." While the doctors prepared the solvent, the curtain to the trauma bay was ripped open. Mark stood there. He was still wearing his tuxedo, but his tie was gone and his eyes were red-rimmed. "Mark," Chloe gasped. She tried to reach out, but her hand was taped down to the gurney rail. "Mark, baby, please, you have to help me." "He forced me. Richard forced me." Mark walked up to the side of the bed. He looked down at Chloe, then at Richard. The sadness in his eyes hardened into something brittle. "Forced you?" Mark asked, his voice shaking. "You were laughing. I heard the recording. Chloe, Hannah played it for me in the car. You called me a poor idiot. You said you were going to me in a car accident, so you could steal Hannah's money." K.H. Lowe's face went pale. "That was a joke. We were just role-playing and the money." Mark asked, "Was the $4 million you two stole a joke, too?" "I did not steal anything." Chloe screamed, her mask finally slipping, her face twisted into a sneer. "It was Richard. He told me he was rich. He told me he would give me the life I deserved. I'm 23 years old. Mark, did you really think I wanted to live in a two-bedroom condo with a junior architect? I deserve a mansion. I deserve this life." The room went silent. The doctor stopped working for a second. Mark nodded slowly. "Well, you got the mansion tonight, and now you have the consequences." He turned to Richard. Richard was staring at the ceiling, refusing to make eye contact. "And you, Mark said you were my brother." Richard opened his mouth to speak, perhaps to spin another lie, but he never got the chance. Mark pulled his arm back and delivered a slap so powerful it echoed off the tiled walls. It was an open-handed strike that snapped Richard's head to the side, leaving a bright red handprint on his cheek. "That is for my sister," Mark said. "Okay, that is enough," a police officer said, stepping into the bay. He was holding a plastic evidence bag. Inside was a clear baggie of white powder and a bottle of pills. "This is Crestwood?" the officer asked, looking at me. "Yes," I answered, composing myself. "We did a search of the personal effects in the gym bag and the lady's purse as per standard procedure for a chemical incident." The officer said, "We found this in Miss Chloe's handbag. It tests positive for MDMA and a significant amount of unregistered prescription narcotics." K.H. Lowe's eyes bulged. "That is not mine. I have never seen that before." And the officer continued, holding up the bottle of pills I had swapped earlier. "We found these in Mr. Crestwood's bag. We also took a statement from you regarding your recent medical issues." "Yes," I said, my voice trembling slightly. "My husband has been giving me those supplements for months. He said they were for my memory, but lately I have been hallucinating. I think he was drugging me." The officer nodded grimly. "We will be testing these pills, ma'am. But preliminarily, this looks like a serious case of domestic abuse and possession with intent to distribute." He turned to the gurney where Richard and K.H. Lowe were lying, still glued together, now facing not just social ruin, but felony charges. "Richard Crestwood and K.H. Lowe Vance," the officer announced, "you are both under arrest. We will place you in custody as soon as the medical procedure is complete." The doctor stepped forward with the vial of solvent. "All right, officers, hold them down. This is going to hurt." He poured the liquid over their joined chests. The chemical reaction was instant. Steam rose from their skin as the solvent attacked the glue. Richard and K.H. Lowe screamed in unison, thrashing against the restraints. The heat was intense, a searing burn that was the price of their liberation. I stood by the door, watching them scream. I felt Mark's hand slip into mine. I squeezed it tight. The pain they were feeling was physical, temporary. The pain they had caused us was gone, replaced by the cold, hard satisfaction of absolute victory. The procedure to separate my husband from his mistress took 4 hours. It was a grueling, meticulous process that required the steady hands of 3 surgeons and the patience of a saint. I sat in the observation gallery of the operating theater, watching through the glass as the medical team applied the solvent I had provided millimeter by agonizing millimeter. The chemical reaction was exothermic, generating significant heat as it dissolved the bonds of the Polygrip 5000. Every time the solvent touched their skin, they screamed. It was a duet of misery that penetrated even the soundproof glass. When they were finally pulled apart, the damage was undeniable. The skin on Richard's chest and thighs, and the corresponding areas on K.H. Lowe's body was raw, blistered, and angry red. The lead surgeon came out to speak to me, wiping sweat from his brow. He explained that the dermis had been severely compromised. They would require skin grafts, and even with the best plastic surgery money could buy, they would both bear thick cloyed scars for the rest of their lives. It was poetic justice. They had wanted to leave a mark on me by destroying my sanity. Instead, I had left a permanent physical brand of their infidelity on their bodies. They would never be able to look in a mirror without remembering this night. But the physical separation was only the beginning of their dismantling. As soon as the anesthesia wore off and they were wheeled into separate recovery rooms, the real sharks began to circle. I had not been idle during the surgery. While they were under the knife, I had made 2 very important phone calls. One was to the local precinct captain, a man who owed Orichem a favor for our donations to the police benevolent fund. The other was to a contact at the Internal Revenue Service. I walked into Richard's room first. He was awake, groggy, and hooked up to a morphine drip. His chest was heavily bandaged. When he saw me, his eyes narrowed with a mix of hatred and fear. "You," he rasped, his voice wrecked from hours of screaming. "You set me up. You swapped the tubes." "I know you did. That is a very serious accusation, Richard," I said, standing at the foot of his bed, "especially coming from a man who was found with illegal hallucinogens in his gym bag. The lab results came back an hour ago. Those pills you have been feeding me, they were not herbal supplements. They were a psilocybin derivative. Attempted poisoning is a felony. Richard, it carries a sentence of 10 to 20 years. Richard tried to sit up, but the pain forced him back down. "I will tell them it was you. I will tell them you planted it. And who will believe you?" I asked, tilting my head. "I am the grieving wife. I am the respected scientist. You are the man who embezzled $4 million from his own family to fund a life of debauchery." "Oh, yes. I sent the proof of embezzlement to the board of directors and my lawyers this morning. They obtained an emergency injunction an hour ago. Your accounts aren't just flagged, Richard. They are locked down pending a federal investigation." At that exact moment, the door opened. 2 uniformed officers stepped in, followed by a detective in a cheap suit. "Richard Crestwood," the detective said, pulling a pair of handcuffs from his belt. "You are under arrest for embezzlement, fraud, and the attempted poisoning of Hannah Crestwood. You have the right to remain silent." Richard looked at the handcuffs, then at me. "Hannah, please do not let them do this. I can fix this. We can make a deal." "There are no deals," I said coldly. "Clause 7B of our prenuptial agreement. I triggered at the moment. I had video proof of your affair. You have forfeited all marital assets. The house, the cars, your shares in the company, they all belong to me now. You are destitute, Richard. You cannot even afford a lawyer." The officer cuffed Richard's hand to the bed rail. I turned and walked out, leaving him pleading with a police officer who clearly did not care. I went next door to K.H. Lowe's room. She was crying, her makeup stree, looking very young and very scared. Mark was standing by the window, his back to her. "Mark, tell them." K.H. Lowe sobbed. "Tell them I did not know about the drugs. Richard put them in my purse." "It does not matter," Chloe Mark said, his voice flat. He did not turn around. "The police found the text messages on your phone. The ones where you asked your dealer for the party favors and the ones where you talked about staging my accident." Chloe went silent. The color drained from her face. "You were going to hurt me," Mark said. turning to look at her. "I love you. I would have given you everything. And you were planning to break my legs for an insurance payout." I was confused. K.H. Lowe stammered. "You are not confused," I said, stepping into the room. "You are a predator, but you picked the wrong prey." The female officer standing guard stepped forward. "Miss Vance, you are under arrest for possession of a controlled substance and conspiracy to commit insurance fraud. We also have outstanding warrants for credit card theft in 3 other states under your previous alias." Mark looked at me. "Let's go." "Hannah, I can't breathe in here." We walked out of the hospital room, leaving Chloe screaming for a second chance that would never come. We stood in the hallway, looking through the observation glass in one room. Richard was shouting at his lawyer on the phone, his face twisted in ugly rage. In the other, H. Lowe was weeping into her hands. They were separated by a wall, but they were united in their total ruin. Mark took a deep breath and let it out slowly. "Is it over?" "Yes," I said, adjusting the collar of my trench coat. "The chemical reaction is complete. The volatile elements have been removed." "I feel lighter," Mark admitted. "Sad, but lighter. That is the feeling of freedom." I told him, "Come on, I will buy you a drink, and then tomorrow we start building something real. No more lies. No more parasites." I looked back at Richard one last time. He caught my eye through the glass. He looked small. He looked pathetic. I did not feel anger anymore. I did not feel hate. I felt the cool, sterile satisfaction of a balanced equation. I had taken the chaos he introduced into my life and neutralized it. I smiled at him, a small, sharp smile that promised nothing but silence. Then I turned my back on him forever and walked down the hospital corridor, my heels clicking a steady rhythm on the linoleum. I was Hannah Crestwood. I was a survivor. And I had proven once and for all that while love might be fleeting, chemistry is absolute. Thank you so much for listening to this story of betrayal and calculated justice. I would love to know where you are tuning in from today. So, please leave a comment below telling me your city or country and let me know what you would have done in Hannah's shoes. If you enjoyed this story, please make sure to subscribe to Azad Revenge Stories, like this video, and smash that like button to help us share these tales with more people around the world. Thanks to all.